Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Waterman. I teach at NYUAD and I'm head of the literature program there. And it's my privilege tonight to be able to introduce one of my colleagues from NYU in New York, Carolyn Dinshaw, the colleague in the English department there, who will be presenting tonight with Marget Long. I'll introduce Marget first, and then I will introduce Carolyn, and then I'll let them start their show. Marget Long's art practice centers on the physical experience and sensory politics of photographic technologies now and in the past. The current project she's working on, Mirage, which I think we'll hear a little bit about tonight, is based on the optical phenomenon of a mirage. Cross-disciplinary in approach, Long sees the physical activities of a mirage, bent light waves that distort, double, and duplicate real objects, as both a photographic and a virtual imaging event, a hybrid event that is useful in thinking about contemporary photography, materiality, and bodily experiences of mapping technologies such as Google Maps. Long's recent artist book, Flash plus Cube, 1965 to 1975, traces the sensory links between light, war, history, and photography through a forgotten piece of technology, the Sylvania Flash Cube. Earlier photographs made under the skylight at Matthew Brady's 19th century daguerreotype studio explore the tangled felt relationship between history, photography, and iconic sites of cultural production. Long received a BA from Harvard and an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, where she was the recipient of the T.C. Colley Award in Photography in 2002. She lectures frequently on photography, new media, and visual culture, most recently at Yale University's Photographic Memory Workshop, and the Center of Visual Cultures at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work has been screened and exhibited at many venues, including Anthology Film Archives, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Brooklyn Museum, British Film Institute, Exit Art, Kunsthaus Bregenz, and American Cinematheque in Los Angeles. She'll be presenting tonight with Carolyn Dinshaw. Carolyn's professor of social and cultural analysis and English, and the chair of the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. Carolyn has been interested in the relationship between the past and the present ever since she began to study medieval literature. Her 1982 dissertation, subsequently published as Chaucer and the Text in 1988, explored the relevance of new critical modes for older literature, while in her 1989 book, Chaucer's Sexual Poetics, she investigated the connection of past and present via the Western discursive tradition of gender. In Getting Medieval, which I have to say I'm really envious of Carolyn's book titles. They get progressively better as her career goes along, but this one was called Getting Medieval. In Getting Medieval, Sexualities and Communities, Pre- and Postmodern, she traced a queer desire for history. In her most recent book, How Soon Is Now, which is a reference to the 80s band The Smiths, if you didn't catch it. How Soon Is Now, Medieval Texts, Amateur Readers, and the Queerness of Time, she looks directly at the experience of time itself, as it is represented in medieval works and as it's experienced in readers of those works. In the classroom, she regularly teaches materials past and present in courses ranging from medieval misogyny to queer New York City. In graduate courses such as Time and Temporality in Medieval Lit, Carolyn has explored expanded notions of history and time, affective history, embodied history, and the feeling of being a body in time, in texts ranging from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy to Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida, to Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, Derrida's Spectres of Mark, and Henri Bergson's Matter and Memory. Dinshaw has recently taught ecological approaches to medieval literature, in which students read medieval texts, especially those featuring a figure of nature, in relation to theoretical materials by, among many others, Timothy Morton, Martin Heidegger, Bruno Latour, Catriona Sandilands, and Bruce Erickson, and Dipesh Chakrabarty. Her work in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, where she's jointly appointed with my department in New York, the English department, has provided a rich context in which to develop these ideas theoretically and cross-culturally. Dinshaw's current research projects extend her interests into the visual field. It's Not Easy Being Green is the title of one project she's working on, which focuses on the eerie figure of the foliate head, a decorative motif well-nigh ubiquitous in medieval church sculpture in Western Europe that became known in the 20th century as the Green Man. This imagined mixture of human and vegetable, a head sprouting leaves or made up of vegetation, is the point of departure for her research on human-non-human relations, queerness and queer sexual subcultures now, the ecological thought, as Timothy Morton puts it, and what medieval literature can tell us about it all. The second project, Exploring Nowhere, Mirages, Digital Maps, and the Historical Problem of Location, is undertaken with visual artist Marget. I'm assuming we'll hear some of it tonight. It's a project that explores paradoxical places where time and space operate differently from all other places on Earth, nowheres that are somewhere, to adapt Alessandro Scaffi's resonant phrase for medieval representations of paradise. Long and Dinshaw looked to the optical phenomenon of the mirage, a strange and elusive nowhere, to explore broad concepts of location and locatability. They investigate the mirage's visual and cultural history through a wide array of materials, medieval maps and legends of paradise, which was in at least one instance thought to be a mirage, early 20th century Arctic exploration, and photographs and video works from Long's project on mirages. Long and Dinshaw take a long view of the mirage, an illusion that prompts an irrational experience of time and space in order to imagine, among other things, how to work and play with current digital mapping technologies intended to work us. So please join me in welcoming Marget Long and Carolyn Dinshaw to Abu Dhabi.
Thank you, Brian, for that very full introduction. We're so happy to be here. We want to thank Brian for the initial invitation, Yuna Chowdhury for encouragement for us to come here, Nils for setting up the details, and you all for attending tonight. So let's get started. Exploring Nowhere. Mirage's digital maps and the historical problem of location. We want to begin today with this strange phrase, non-existent at 82 degrees 30 minutes north, 108 degrees 22 minutes west. We came upon this weird description in the online catalog of an archive at the American Museum of Natural History, the archive of an Arctic expedition that took place about a century ago. You're looking at the page from the online finding aid. The phrase specifies the geographical coordinates of a continent that never existed, a continent dubbed Crockerland that turned out to be an Arctic mirage. This illusory landmass, this nowhere, with precise longitudinal and latitudinal measurements fascinated us. We were attracted to such a paradoxical locale, a place geographically pinpointed that can't be found, can't be reached, can't be touched. A nowhere. Nonetheless, a nowhere that is somewhere. Non-existent at 82 degrees, 30 minutes north, 108 degrees, 22 minutes west. Such hyper-location of a non-existent place not only amused us, but that finding aid also gave us access to an entire archive built on a geographical fiction, a non-place that, for at least a certain period of time, was pursued as a real continent. We felt a kind of perverse pleasure in working in this archive because in our present moment, such mistakes, such profound location unawareness seem nearly impossible. Nearly impossible, although Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 managed to disappear seemingly without a trace. Now that flight is shocking because we assume everything is locatable. The world is now aerially mapped and digitally imaged many times over. And as those of us using mobile devices know, in our everyday wanderings, we have access to a vast layered array of these digital maps. These maps are the backbone of location-aware applications that use GPS technologies to pinpoint us and to monetize our gender, race, class, and economic positions in space and time. Such fully elaborated non-places as Crockerland are no longer possible in our present cartographic realm. The Crockerland explorers created a set of code words to communicate their findings in the field via telegraph to people back home. As you can see in this slide, a convoluted, contradictory range of geographic possibilities is indicated. Crockerland is very big, or it's small, or it's not there at all. It's there but inaccessible, or they remained there for innumerable weeks. We came to realize that this text, this code, contains the illogic and maybe even the visual poetics of a mirage itself, a real optical phenomenon that creates distortions, misperceptions, a big question mark on the horizon. But no surprise, this code is the product of an expedition that was instigated by a mirage. It's loopy, heterogeneous, speculative, queer in its sense of space and time, imagining a landscape that is unmappable, irrational, full of both desire and potential failure. Such broad strokes of possibility, all over the map, you might say, are foreclosed by routinized and unreflective uses of current technologies that demarcate the world in ever greater detail. So in our joint project to rethink and analyze broad concepts of location and locatability, Marget and I have turned to the optics and concept of the mirage, a truly strange and lovely nowhere. We look to the mirage, its technical definition, as well as its visual and cultural histories, in order to explore what might escape, or at the very least reshape, these ever-growing mechanisms of location. Marget, an artist, has been chasing mirages in the American landscape with her camera, as well as exploring their various disappearing acts in Hollywood film and animation and historical archives. She's interested in photographs that perform more than just their expected indexical function. Such photographs perfectly exemplify what Robert Frank claims about photography, that it exists in the thin area between objectivity and interpretation, in the place, quote, where matter ends and the mind begins, unquote. For me, the medieval scholar, it all began with Eden, with medieval maps and legends of that originary, all but unreachable place on Earth, where time and space are different from those of every other sublunar locale. Nowhere that is somewhere is in fact historian Alessandro Scaffi's concise description of the Garden of Eden on medieval maps. When I went chasing medieval legends of paradise, I encountered narratives of a landmass that people later said was a mirage. With our different backgrounds and predilections, we bring you a broad, some might say crazy, array of materials together today. Legends and maps from the Middle Ages, optical illusions in the Arctic, photography, and digital maps, increasingly dependent on photography. We're using the mirage as an analytical tool with which to understand location and with which to imagine how to work and play with digital mapping schemes that seek to work us, to fix us, to use us, to capitalize on us. So far, our work has been American and European focus, and we'll present that to you today. But what excites us about being here with you is the opportunity to learn more about the visual history and culture of mirages in this part of the world from the multiple perspectives that this audience, we hope, will provide. So, this talk is in 5 parts.
Part 1, Crockerland. In 1906, from the northernmost point of an island in far northern Canada, Arctic explorer Rear Admiral Peary saw a snow-capped landmass glimmering in the distance. This was just the kind of big discovery he had hoped to make, and he marked his discovery by building a stone cairn on the spot. Peary immediately declared the distant landmass to be a continent, named it Crockerland after one of his benefactors, and drew it on the map. You can see the depiction of Crockerland, sort of banana-shaped, way over on the top left there, printed on the expedition map. Peary's expedition was organized by the American Museum of Natural History and the American Geographical Society, funded in large part through donations from major industrialists with the understanding that they would get polar loot in return for their investment: animal skins, rare birds' eggs, Inuit tools, and the like, channeled through the duty-free mechanisms of the museum. Knowing full well that Crockerland could be a mirage because of their prevalence in Arctic conditions, Peary still made this claim of discovery. He knew it would need to be confirmed, and he badly wanted to get another expedition funded. Yet there were Crockerland doubters from the get-go, somber geologists on the one hand and other Arctic explorers on the other, Peary's competitors in the race to the North Pole. But indeed, as Perry had wanted, a follow-up expedition was organized several years later by the museum and Perry's protege, Donald Macmillan, to confirm the sighting, and in Macmillan's words, to solve the world's last geographical problem. They set out from Brooklyn Navy Yards for the Arctic in the summer of 1913. And here's Macmillan's proposed route to Crocker Land. His route is traced onto an earlier expedition map. Crocker Land is off the map. Penciled into the legend, it's sketched as a curved blue line, the eastern edge of a shoreline of what could either be a limitless landmass or almost nothing. The full contours, location, and existence of Crocker Land figure here as sketchy, inexact, and provisional. Yet the very crudeness and intensity of those hand-drawn lines express the imaginative pull of this unknown place, this hypothetical continent. We found this map in the Crocker Land expedition papers at the museum. In the spring of 1914, after months of hard travel, Macmillan and his team started the extremely grueling journey across the polar ice towards the spot where Perry had drawn Crocker Land on the map. Macmillan is here on the left, and on the top he's taking latitudinal and longitudinal measurements on his belly with old school location devices, the chronometer and the sextant. The photos on the bottom give you some sense of the scale of the jumbled sea ice and the staggering challenges of crossing the polar sea. And these are also images from the Crocker Land expedition field photographs from the museum. Macmillan and his final four-man crew, including 2 Inuit guides, at last closed in on the place where Perry had seen and marked his continent on the map. It was thrilling, as Macmillan later reflected in his memoir, quote, "April 21st was a beautiful day. All mist was gone and the clear blue of the sky extended down to the very horizon. There could be no doubt about it. Great heavens, what a land, hills, valleys, snow-capped peaks, extending through at least 120 degrees of the horizon," end quote. They walked and walked toward these snow-capped peaks, but came no closer to them. The peaks came and went from sight, depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun. The most experienced Inuit guide said it was a pujok, a mist. Or he might have said it was an ijirak, a shape-shifting creature whose presence was indicated by the presence of a mirage. But Macmillan insisted that they press on until he finally admitted that they had passed the place on the map where Crocker Land was marked. Here's a much more deflated Macmillan later recounting his moment of reckoning. Quote, "We had not only reached Perry's brown spot on the map, but we were 30 miles inland. You can imagine how earnestly we scanned every foot of that horizon, not a thing in sight. We were convinced that we were in pursuit of a will-o'-the-wisp, ever receding, ever changing, ever beckoning," end quote. This is a photo, this photo of an iceberg is from the Crocker Land photo collection. And in museum publications, this ethereal image is often used as a stand-in for Crocker Land itself. A stand-in because there was no Crocker Land, and so obviously no photo of it. But you can take a photograph of a mirage, and therefore we wondered if there was one in the museum's collection. Macmillan and his company took pictures of pretty much everything under the Arctic sun. The archive has nearly 5,000 still photos as well as moving images, and Carolyn and I looked at every single one of those still images as well as the film clips for an image of the mirage, and it's not there. But the lack of documentation of the mirage was not for lack of photographic zeal or sophistication. The museum purchased top-of-the-line cameras in multiple formats and provided a fully equipped darkroom for the explorers. Photographic documentation, in fact, was part of the Crocker Land mission statement. This is another photo of one of the crew operating the movie camera on the expedition. So after 3 days immersed in that archive, it was abundantly clear to us that that photographic mission was fulfilled. The archive contains photos of clouds, landscapes, icebergs, Arctic animals, Inuit people, expedition staff, and even a woman suffering from Arctic hysteria. In the middle here is one of the many multiple exposure photographs of the midnight sun, confirming the explorers' interest in atmospheric phenomena and their desire and ability to photograph them. But despite Macmillan's account in his field notes of how beautiful and real Crocker Land looked on the journey across the polar sea, no photo was taken. Instead of the photo we wanted to find, we found this one. a picture that Macmillan took at Perry's cairn. Remember the spot where Perry originally saw Crockerland shining in the distance. Macmillan stopped by the cairn on his way back from the unsuccessful journey, and oddly enough, he reported seeing a spectacular panoramic mirage, just like the one Perry had seen there. But curiously, rather than photograph it right then and there, Macmillan took this photo instead, this solid and unquestionable record of location, one of his crew and the American flag. There are many possible explanations for the lack of the picture we so badly wanted to see. Here's one. By not fixing a mirage on film, Macmillan and the museum may have tried to co-opt the illusory and deceptive nature of a mirage for their own institutional benefit, deflecting or even refracting the shadiness of the entire enterprise, the tax-free gift scheme that moved goods from the Inuits to the museum and private collections. That's a speculation about the motivations of the explorers in the museum, a hypothesis about rapacious collecting and cynical institution building. But we can also consider the Mirage in a broader cultural context of US nationalism and American imperial claims, always over there, in the distance, just out of reach, but apparently beckoning. The Mirage provides an optic, a vision of expansionist dreams. No surprise then that at the time Perry, Macmillan, and their teams were chasing Crockerland for the American Museum of Natural History, Russian explorers were scanning the same horizon for their Crockerland, that is, Sannikov Land, an elusive land in the Arctic first perceived in the early 19th century, sought throughout the 20th century, and still operant in the Putin-era imaginary as a hoped-for location of oil and gas reserves. But back to Macmillan's expedition of 1913. Once Macmillan reported that there was no continent, dozens of articles shot out over the wires, and for years afterwards, the museum tried to justify the huge expense of the failed 4-year expedition. Macmillan and other members of the crew defended their pursuit of Crockerland in print. Fitzhugh Green, engineer and physicist on the expedition, in an article on his Arctic duty, contrasted the theories of men of science in their laboratories with the more freewheeling imaginations of men like Macmillan. Green argued that for these imaginative men, it made sense to look for what he called polar paradise. Within the inception of the expedition, Green claimed, and this is a quotation, lay embedded a legend of the Eskimos, which described a distant oasis inhabited by their own race. So perfect was this spot in its abundance of game and sunlight that he who settled there, whether from fortune or design, never returned. The bliss of endless seasons and easy plenty at once cleared memory of mother and wife and even children. Green's narrative here of this native legend imagines vanished Eskimos, cut off from the rest of humankind, living in perpetual delight in this polar paradise. And the Crockerland explorers might have come upon them, he enthused. In his gusto, even years after the expedition had found nothing, you can sense that the legend remains powerful for him. Quote, "They're true, these legends, every one of them, until they're disproved. Find your Jules Verne," he exhorts his readers, "and follow me to the center of the earth."
Part 2, Fortunate Isle. So how do you locate paradise? Those blissed-out Eskimos in their polar paradise, without mothers, wives, or children, are like the men in another northern legend of exploration, this one a Christian story of monks seeking and finding paradise in the Arctic. This legend is an adventure tale inspired by ancient narratives of journeys as well as early Christian saints' lives. It portrays the holiness of its protagonist, the seafaring Saint Brendan, but also, and for the most part, gives a detailed account of his long journey in a leather boat across the North Atlantic, his expedition to confirm a sighting of the earthly paradise in the Arctic. The Latin text, written in the 8th or 9th century, tells us that in a monastery in remote Western Ireland, St. Brendan was watching over his flock of monks. One day, another abbot, Berend, came to visit, telling Brendan of a journey he had taken oversea to an island toward the west. Berend had said he had sailed to the, quote, promised land of the saints, which God will give to those who come after us at the end of time, unquote. When Berend and his men approached it in their boat, the island was enveloped in a dense fog. But after they had lingered for an hour, the darkness cleared and the land was finally revealed in a great light. They disembarked onto its shores. You're looking at a manuscript from the 15th century of the text I'm using, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani. Describing the island, Berend recalled with wonder, quote, "We saw no plants that had not flowers, nor trees that had not fruit. The stones of that land are precious stones," unquote. An angelic being guarding the island made it clear that Berend and his men had, in fact, reached Eden, where Adam and Eve first dwelled. Berend and his monks had found the earthly paradise. The promised land was, in fact, fused with the Garden of Eden, the end of time when the elect will reach the promised land, fused with the beginning of time in Eden. That's historian Alessandro Scaffi's point. And you're looking at a 16th century German woodcut showing the perfect Eden created by God above. Berend continued telling St. Brendan about his experience on this island. He recalled that he and his monks explored the island for what felt like days and found it boundless. The angel they encountered there informed them that it hadn't been just days, though. They had been there a year, needing neither food nor drink nor sleep in the perpetual daylight. The flora, geology, weather, space, and time were completely different there from that of the rest of the earth. After speaking to them of the island's wondrous nature, the angel insisted that they couldn't stay there any longer. So Berend and his monks returned to their own monastery. When they got back, their clothes smelled paradisiacally of the land of promise. That was the end of Berend's story, and when he finished telling his Edenic tale, Brendan and his monks were stunned. They threw themselves on the ground, prostrate, and praised the Lord. They wanted to go there. They wanted to experience that paradise of which they had just heard. Brendan resolved, if it was God's will, quote, to go in search of this place where, according to a later source, quote, "You will find health without sickness, delight without quarreling, union without wrangling, rest without idleness, freedom without labor, feasting without extinction," and the list goes on. Who wouldn't want to go to this exceptional place on earth immediately? It took Brendan and his monks 7 years, sailing west and east and north and south, much of the time without oars and rudder, the will of God providing the wind in their direction. This is an image circa late 13th century from a French book of saints' lives. They encountered a fish, a whale that they thought was an island. They found a delightful spot in the sea populated by giant sheep and another island with birds that chanted the praises of God. They encountered demons. Here's a 15th century manuscript image of the whale that they took to be a landmass. But at last, they found paradise. Its precise whereabouts had been kept from them for 7 years by God, who was operating his own divine location services. As the angel put it to Brendan, quote, "You could not find it immediately because God wanted to show you his varied secrets in the great ocean." Unquote. Just as described earlier by Berend, this Edenic space Brendan approached was enveloped by a great fog. Emerging into view, the island was as abundant and as boundless, as unique and unearthly as advertised. The angel greeted them all by name and confirmed that this was indeed the land they had been seeking, the promised land Berend had seen. Confirmation given, he then instructed them to return to their monastery. They went back, and as prophesied by the angel, Brendan soon died. Where exactly was St. Brendan's Island, that unearthly, earthly paradise, the land of promise? The text is unusual in that it goes into great detail in describing his journey, beginning in the waters to the west of Ireland. Scholars have attempted to identify the lands he traversed, all the islands he touched on, south of the Arctic expeditions centuries later, to be sure, but perhaps in the general vicinity. Was Crockerland one of those islands? Was it Brendan's polar paradise? A late 13th century English map of the world, called the Hereford Mappa Mundi, pictured here, located this Edenic land of promise. Not in the north. It appears off the western coast of Africa because ancient classical reports of fortunate islands connected to the Canary Island region were linked with the voyage of St. Brendan. The region of Brendan's voyage is at the bottom edge here, along with the monstrous races imagined in the unknown lands off Africa. On this map, which is very large, over 5 feet by 4 feet, drawn on the height of a large calf, the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise, an island, is at the top, and the region of Brendan's voyage, including paradise, is at the bottom. On the left here is a detail of the Garden of Eden. It's hard to see, but Adam and Eve are there, as is the serpent and the 4 rivers of the earthly paradise. On the right, there is the outermost island of St. Brendan's voyage. The label says, the 6 fortunate islands are the islands of St. Brendan. It's a little hard to see detail here, but I wanted to give you the flavor of this intensely detailed map with rivers, cities, and mountains with textual rubrics. But the point I want to make is that paradise is at the top and paradise is at the bottom. Showing 2 places as separate in space, even though they're meant to be the same place, is characteristic of this kind of map. As medievalist Martin Foys puts it, a mappamundi is, quote, not contained by the laws of physical existence, even as it simulates the physical world, unquote. Foys argues that a mappamundi constructed with a range of technologies, for example, a visual grid and textual narrative, offers a virtual environment not tied to physical possibility in the primary world. It's no surprise that paradise, where the ordinary laws of space and time don't hold, should feature prominently and even be spread out in opposite sectors across this map. A mixed reality space, this medieval map forms a world as much as represents it. I'll get back to that mixed reality point later, but now I want to shift from the medieval to the early modern context. Here's an early modern woodcut showing St. Brendan's Isle. Early modern explorers, unlike St. Brendan, did not wait for God's location services to show them the way to paradise, and didn't stop with the Mappamundi's virtual experience of reality. There were at least 4 separate expeditions, beginning in the early 16th century and running through the early 18th, to confirm the existence of this island. Multiple expeditions were necessary because, strangely, people said, the island would appear and then it would disappear. It came, it went. Did it exist? A late 18th century treatise by a Jesuit argued both sides of the question. He reprinted an earlier image of the island, pictured here, and concluded that the whole thing could be but atmospheric refraction. The island could be, that is, a mirage. In the 19th century, geographer Konrad Maltebrun concurred that behind the tradition of this island paradise, St. Brendan's Island, might be, quote, one of those optical illusions by which the image of a real coast is repeated in the clouds. For these references, I want to acknowledge the work of Robert Benedict and also of Andrew T. Young. Different from all other places on Earth, a limitless space in a slowed down time, collapsing the origin of human life with its end, paradise is on the map, but it's the lost island, as the caption on the great Ebsdorf Mappamundi maintains. And here is the wonderful Ebsdorf map, where the whole world is figured as Christ's body. See his head at the top and hands and feet at the sides and bottom. The lost island, the Insula Perdita, is one of the empty rectangles on the bottom right. St. Brendan took his monks there, and Baron did too, but no one else has found it. An unlocatable island with specific coordinates. It seems to be located at 10 degrees 10 minutes of longitude, 20 degrees 30 minutes of latitude, according to a 17th century Franciscan friar. It's a nowhere that is somewhere. This paradise, you could say, like Crockerland, is a mirage.
Part 3, Desert Mirage. To experience a mirage is to temporarily inhabit an ideal, to live an illusion, to witness an exception in the landscape. To encounter a mirage is to feel the vividness and the urgency of desire itself. and then to watch that vision, that desire, slowly recede, dissolve, and finally vanish from sight. To experience a mirage is to question what we see and what we think we know for sure. The clip here is from Road to Morocco, 1942, starring Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Dorothy Lamour, who appears later in a sequined turban. In many of these Hollywood mirage narratives, Arabs are grossly stereotyped as savages or buffoons, and the desert is a brutal wasteland that, badly needs good hamburgers and fries. In these cinema representations of the desert, the mirage allows these stereotypes to be even further magnified, distorting these representations of foreignness so completely that no one and nothing is normal. But let's back up a bit. How is it that I was first drawn to this exceptional landscape? My interest in mirages began with a single photograph, this 19th century landscape photographer unknown. I found this photo in a 1960s book about optical effects. The blotchy picture of what appeared to be a shoreline didn't really interest me until I read its caption, which said, "Mirage, Sahara Desert." How completely meta, as my students like to say. A photograph about photography, the burning desire to fix an image for future consideration, yet simultaneously a picture attesting to its own slippery relationship to the thing that it depicts. Of course, when the photographer stood in front of that scene on the Sahara Desert, there was something physically there. A mirage is a real, if immaterial thing, an optical phenomenon that occurs when thermal layers on the Earth's surface bend light waves and refract them in unusual ways. In other words, the atmosphere acts as a kind of giant lens that bends light and projects images into places where we don't ordinarily see them. In the case of a desert mirage, hot air pressed against colder air above causes an image of the sky to be reflected onto the surface of the sand. That refraction of blue light is then interpreted in the mind of the viewer as water. But back to this picture, what was the photographer up to here? Was she simply making a hasty record of the mirage effect before it disappeared? Or was the photographer slyly or even intuitively pointing to the ontological problems posed by photographs themselves, literally exposing the shifty, dubious, and illusory quality of all photographs? Propelled by the questions embedded in this picture, I set out on a kind of photographic quest, where the mirage would be both my photographic subject and my analytical object. When you live in New York City, where do you find a mirage? A something that is nothing? In what kind of place can you be guaranteed to see an illusion? At first, I used place names as my guide. Rancho Mirage, California sounded promising. The corner of Mirage Road and Mirage Road in Rancho Mirage, even better. So 2 summers ago, we were able to go to Rancho Mirage, and here's one of the first photos that I took there. It's just a small puddle of a mirage, total garden variety, and of course, in the UAE, you see these on the highway all the time. If the photograph looks a little strange to you, it's because it has a super shallow depth of field produced by using a long telephoto lens, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second. No mirage was too inferior in the beginning, and the term inferior is actually technically correct. It refers to the kind of mirage that appears below the real object. Superior mirages refract the illusion above the real object. This latter kind of mirage is also known as a fata morgana and usually occurs in Arctic settings, as in the case of Admiral Perry's faux continent. So the snow gets refracted up into the sky and would look like a distant landmass. But back to California. After miraging in the suburbs for a few days, I set my sights on a place called El Mirage Dry Lake Bed, a dusty prehistoric lake bed east of Los Angeles. With a name like that, I was pretty sure it held a lot of promise. So this is me on the lake bed. This entire operation felt very speculative and goofy, even more so than the ordinary art project. I had cast myself as the cartoonish optimist, visiting the desert in August, seeking out the not really there, the unlocatable, chasing the unearthly with a ridiculously large lens, searching also for something that I knew in advance would desert me. Underlying my desire to be in this place was undoubtedly the 20th century version of that narrative of unattainable delights, the Mirage scenario audiences have seen so many times in movies, TV, and cartoons. So a mirage is not only an optical and physical phenomenon, it's also a cultural refraction as well. So I started collecting film versions, cinema versions of these narratives and carefully stringing them together to produce a kind of perpetual mirage sequence where hope, desire, and failure repeatedly play out. I'm just going to play about a 4-minute clip from this longer 25-minute piece called You Were Drifting. The work combines clips from about 25 films that depict the advent of a mirage. And the stacked video monitors create a kind of secondary mirage effect. The inverted lower monitor refracts the scene in the upper monitor. And what's clear in these particular clips is that the scarce economies of the desert and fears of the other figure prominently in many of these mirage narratives. I'm going to play a close-up view of the installation because it's much easier to see.
I'm coming. Mama, Papa. Mama.
No, no. Don't put me on hold. Oh, God. I can't die out here. Oh, this wasn't the plan.
Looney Tunes.
After this comedy, promised myself I would only do real movies about the human condition crammed with social relevance.
There's nothing but a big rock for 10 miles in that, and that direction, so... Say we go that way.
Say, who are you kidding here? We're goners. Water! I can't die now. Think of the millions of children who want me to have the diamond. Oh, the poor children.
Oh, look at that!
Is it a mirage or just product placement? Hey, who cares? With shopping convenience at such low prices. Water, Fresca, Mountain Dew, your product name here.
Is this your idea?
The audience expects it. They don't even notice this kind of thing anymore.
Okay, I'll stop there. That's a bit from Jerry in the middle and Carry On, Follow That Camel in 1968. Mirage movie. So the space and time of a mirage are completely different from those of an ordinary landscape. A mirage is never close, it's always way over there, off in the distance. It defies normal laws of movement and perspective. Run towards a mirage at top speed and you don't get any closer to it. It remains stubbornly the same relative size and distance from you, always just out of reach. Movement without progress. get too close to a mirage and it dissolves altogether. The angle of the refraction changes in relation to our eyes, and poof, it vanishes. And this is one of my photographs from the lake bed. The water you're looking at is, of course, a refraction of the sky, both there and not really there. The photograph is printed on metallic paper, and it's quite small for a landscape print at only 14 by 9. The small scale of the prints is important to me because I want the pictures to fall kind of outside of traditional landscape photography, where images are often printed at monumental scale. To want to photograph a mirage is to want to picture something that is already riddled with doubt. It is to be complicit with the photograph's tangled relationship to what it depicts. Remember Donald McMillan, who didn't want to go to this indexical Never Never Land. This is a photo from the Salt Flats in Utah. Notice that the mountains appear to be lifted up, and the truck is doubled up, and the telephone poles on the interstate are also distorted. Is a mirage an image of the past, a projection of the future, or a picture of the present? Like any photograph, a mirage is bound up in more than one time. And a photograph of a mirage, how many different temporalities are in play there? When William Henry Fox Talbot, one of the inventors of photography, developed a process that he called photogenic drawing, in which he made direct imprints of nature on paper using sunlight. And I'd like to suggest that all these years later, Talbot's photogenic drawing, in which natural objects delineate themselves, could describe the way that a mirage works, the way it writes itself into the world. Couldn't we imagine a mirage as a kind of enormous photographic activity? The mirage, after all, creates an image with light, and this happens outside of and unaided by a camera. In fact, at many times when I was out there on the lake bed, my camera felt very small and superfluous, and my strongest sensation was that I was both inside of a giant camera or perhaps in front of a vast photograph. If a mirage presents itself in the landscape in this, let's call it, super photogenic way, can it, like the prick of a good picture, and those are Barth's words, also leave its mark on our bodies? It certainly did for us. The longer we stood on those lake beds, the more fully we were able to inhabit the unstable region between the real and the unreal, the recordable and the illusory, the material and the imaginary. Another way to say this is that a mirage is a kind of mixed reality space, and mixed reality is media theorist Jason Farman's term, which he uses to describe Google Maps' near seamless collaboration between the material landscape and the digital interface. His claim is that in a mixed reality space, you're experiencing an impossibility. You're in two places at once, both watching your screen and actually in the landscape. So the Mirage allowed us a different mode of being. This landscape, this mixed reality space, was asking something of us. It was asking us to participate with it, to collaborate with it. It was saying, come be with me. But also, of course, you'll never find me. I'm just going to play another short bit from the You Were Drifting piece. This segment from the Three Stooges, We Want Our Mummy, 1939. Notice the intensive wordplay on the word mirage, which itself is refracting and breaking apart language.
Look, water, real pure salty water. It's the ocean.
Ocean nothing, that's a mirage.
Mirage is something you see yourself in. That's a mirage.
Mirage? That's where you keep your automobile.
I said a mirage.
Mirage, mirage, whatever it is, I'm going swimming.
Water?
Maybe he's got something here.
You think I'm crazy? Come on, try it. The last one in is an old man.
Come on. Ready, set, go.
Okay. A mirage renders itself in the landscape like an unfolding natural disaster, or perhaps something born of this, a primitive special effect. When we witness a mirage in person, or hear in its further mediated form in this video clip, we cannot help but think about its relationship to the virtual landscapes that we experience in GIS interfaces like Google Street View. GIS is the acronym for Geographic Imaging Systems, of course. In this clip, the otherworldly thing you're looking at is called a dust devil, and these often appear in the landscape with the mirages, kind of ghost on ghost.
Part 4, Google's Earth. When we were there, we found it impossible to see the lake bed, or any landscape for that matter, as separable from technologized space. Our accumulated screen time accompanied us, even tracked us to this remote spot on the desert. When we come to look at a place in real life, we now also see it photographed, geotagged, and subsumed into one of Google's many immersive GIS systems. It seems to us that distinctions between the physically real and the virtual, the material and the immaterial, are collapsing as we increasingly engage technologies that merge these realms. What better example could there be of a nowhere somewhere than the limbo created via this interface, where in Abu Dhabi and in Google's desert, a place constructed by their multi-eyed cameras, photos have been stitched together to form a navigable 3D space. It's a world that puts us in a temporal limbo too. We're there in the present moment, moving around inside images of the past. It's nowhere and not now, yet it's geolocated, geo-coordinated, precisely somewhere and in our present. The Earth we now live on is Google Earth. Street View, the interface for what Google advertises as a new and exciting kind of armchair tourism, has been around since 2008. It penetrated off-road sites using its new Trekker cameras beginning in 2010. The Google camera cars are scheduled to hit the Abu Dhabi streets in the coming months. The car was unveiled in Dubai last month. The fact that this is a globalized, private, aggressively for-profit venture using images with a military genealogy is widely discussed and has been critiqued extensively. One such critique counterposes this totally commercialized, monetized geography with a medieval map, the Hereford map, to return to that fabulous Mappa Mundi. Renaissance scholar Jerry Broughton, just this past summer, unveiled his collaboration with artist Adam Lowe, a 3D facsimile of the Hereford map done in white plaster. This touchable, full-size facsimile is a print, digitally produced, of the surface of the map, recording all the irregularities of the calf's skin itself. This project of, quote, taking maps back from Google, as the Telegraph put it, was brought to our attention by Josephine Livingstone, a PhD student at NYU, doing amazing work on medieval maps. As Jerry Broughton writes, quote, freed from the original decorative detail of monsters and mythical stories and approached as a physical rather than a written and painted object, this new map shows that the Mappa Mundi was originally conceived as a three-dimensional object. The surface is an undulating, rippling skin across which the medieval map makers created rivers and continents, working with and against the creases, scars, and folds of the animal's flayed body, unquote. Broughton wants to re-physicalize the experience of using a map and the conditions of making a map. Maps have become inhuman, he writes, driven by the imperatives of e-commerce rather than a confrontation with physical terrestrial reality. That's the end of his quotation. As products of commercial globalization, he finds that they are, quote, not so helpful in engaging with the vast, sensuous, fragile world out there. Broughton's response recaptures the physical and reminds us of the intensive and intricate relationship with the outside, including animals, that once went into creating a map. He wants to celebrate what he calls the physical diversity of the Earth, not merely its economic geography. So his 3D Hereford map shows the ways skin mirrors hills and valleys of the landscape. It engages the physicality of touch. It will broaden the range of users of the map. Blind people can now interact with it. It will tell scholars much about the provenance of the Mappamundi and other conditions of its making. It's a brilliant project in the way that it reimagines how a map works, the way it understands how the Hereford Mappamundi creates another world, a world of hybridity in which the very terrain is an animal. It's interesting that Broughton strips the Mappamundi of all the things, visual grid, painting, text, all the multimedia that make it a virtual environment, as Martin Foys sees. And in the way that he's described it, Broughton creates a sharp contrast between the medieval map and current mapping technologies. The medieval, for Broughton, stands in for rooted, fixed, pure materiality. And, no surprise, it's a bovine body that represents this kind of reality. But the technologies of the Mappamundi were already virtual. The Mappamundi is a mixed reality space, and therefore it's the perfect medium, always already new, to quote Lisa Gittleman, for paradise, that locational impossibility. Because paradise suggests another kind of reality, a mixed reality, not either or by its very nature. Experience is different there. Ordinary physical laws are suspended. Sensory experiences, sight, hearing, and touch, aren't interpretable in the ordinary ways. They belong to a different mode of existence, as Alessandro Scaffi puts it. Eden's paradoxical or operatic nature, its mirageness, its mixed reality, captured by the Mappamundi, can open up for us other ways of being in which the mutually exclusive criteria of true or false, the irreducible logics of matter and spirit, reality and figment, now and then, somewhere and nowhere, yield to a different experience of the senses. Some illusions are real. Look at Curly here, disporting himself in his crazy, silly illusion. It's sensuous, it's embodied. He's lost his mind.
Part 5, Second Life. Is my mic working? Okay. What if rather than fully vacating the digital interface and returning to the real via a physicalized object, the solid plaster map, what if we were to hang out in these mixed reality spaces a little longer? Is there diversity, to use Broughton's term, to be found there? We think there's pleasure to be had therein that is not fully complicit with or contained by Google's venture. These GIS spaces we find are more heterogeneous than Broughton seems to be allowing. Like a mirage, these landscapes invite imaginative thinking. There are irrational spaces to explore within the highly rational space of Google's mapping software, new narratives and alternative histories to be spun. Before we end today, I'd like to show a short 4-minute segment from my video work in progress called Crockerland. Crockerland, for my purposes, is a mirage in all the ways that we've suggested. An impossible landscape, a real place, a no place, a museum economy, a distortion, a displacement, a hole in the archive. In this video, still very much a rough sketch of the piece I'll ultimately make, I address history by moving in and out of the asynchronous medium of GIS. I inhabit the weather-beaten body of a hybrid historical figure, Donald McMillan and Robert Perry, who comes to terms with his second life on Google Earth. One thing that's helpful to know is that in 1897, Perry stole a meteorite, the Inuits' sole source of metal, and transported it back to New York and sold it to the Museum of Natural History. So we'll end with this clip.
My name is Dawn Mirage. You probably recognize my face. I was an Arctic explorer of some note. I retired to this desert town in 1975. The skies were clear then, and my days were well mapped out. I landscaped. I watched the Prehistory Channel. I started writing my polar memoir. Not too many years ago, the puffy white words rolled in out of nowhere, like vapors from a fleet of tiny airplanes. Despite those planes scribbling overhead and all that extra aerial oversight, things have gone badly out of sync. The house I rented is still for lease, and 2 of the meteorites I put in the front yard last spring have vanished. I've looked for those meteorites everywhere, but I think they're hidden off-screen, behind the streaky picture walls, as part of some future landscape that's already in my past.
Sorry, but I'm a little bit confused because there didn't seem to be a proper separation of the two definitions of what a mirage is. A mirage, as you pointed out, but didn't really, or showed us, but didn't really point out, is that, you know, there is the physical manifestation of a mirage, a scientific mirage, which is this inversion, a temperature inversion on the surface of something like a road, which appears as a puddle of water. And certainly that can be photographed. However, there is also the mirage, which you alluded to in your clips, of a hallucination. And this is now a psychological phenomenon. And certainly that cannot be photographed. So I'm a bit confused then when you say that, well, we photographed this mirage, or we hypothesize that this mirage was, say, taking your example of the map of Mundi, is this the result of the physical, technical definition of what a mirage is, or is this a hallucination, or the figment of imagination, or of the result of psychological? So anyway, could you be a little more, provide a little more definition of these different terms, or what your application of these different terms to what you were presenting?
I think what you're picking up on is exactly what we were trying to suggest, that the mirage is It's a technical optical phenomenon, and it also is the basis of a cultural narrative. And so we were trying to suggest some of that cultural narrative in the Hollywood movies and animations. In that cultural narrative, you're totally right. There's a mixture of the mirage, that phenomenon that we were describing as an optical illusion, and the mirage as optical illusion, we will all in the same room see the same mirage. If there's a mirage to be seen, we'll all see the same mirage. It's not a fantasy, it's not a hallucination, it's a real phenomenon that we interpret in the same way. But in the cultural narratives in those Hollywood movies, Mirage gets mixed up with oasis and with fantasy, with hallucination. So in the very first clip, with the dancer and the airman who's looking at the dancer, there are clearly elements of fantasy and desire and hallucination mixed with mirage. But when he licks his lips, he could be feeling thirsty, and that would be a reference to the mirage, desert mirage showing water, or it could be a reference to that desired fantasy hallucination of a woman that he's seeing. So we mixed them up a little bit, but we're trying to suggest that that there is a reality, there is a real optical phenomenon that can be captured, that is the basis for all of these cultural narratives that then get elaborated and mixed up.
But that being said, the one thing that you also might be picking up on is that it clearly is some kind of neurological event. Something happens, and that's something that we actually don't know much about, and don't profess to really know the neurology of this. And it's something that I'd like to look at a little more. I don't know if that was built into your question, but I think that does have to do with like seeing something that we want to see in a landscape based on a physical phenomenon. One person's going to see a near naked lady dancing, another is going to see water, and so on and so on.
I guess I, of course, got hung up on the animal skin map. And that made me begin to wonder about the way you're connecting mirages and maps. Mm-hmm. And the project that you showed where they had a plaster mm-hmm. version of the Mappa Mundi, you quoted the artist or the folks who are doing that as saying that digital maps are becoming inhuman. Mm-hmm. And in response, they've gone back but I felt that what fell out of there was the fact that that map was always inhuman. It was an animal skin. And I'm even wondering whether maps are, in some very fundamental way, a mode of alienation. A mode, in other words, that the line between the original Mappa Mundi and Google Technologies, GIS, is a pretty continuous line. And that in order to start that story, there was a repression, a sacrifice, which is the animal sacrifice, the body of the animal. And yet, in your discussion of the Mirage, you seem to want to go back, you want to harness the mirage for a new life of the body, a new experience of the body, as you showed us when Curly was performing the mirage there. And so I just wonder whether in fact, the Mirage is a kind of opportunity for performance and for a kind of a non-visual, animalized experience that is, in some sense, unmappable. And that the minute you go into these maps, you've already lost the logic of the Mirage, or the promise,
the illogic of the Mirage, the kind of irrationality of the Mirage.
Yeah.
I'm glad we touched on all of your topics, Una. Performance, animal skins, we got them all. But yes, I think that's really what we were trying to suggest is that within the mapping technologies, whether medieval or current, whether physical with the animal skin, and I think there the suggestion is that the animal was lived with very closely in a medieval context. So it's not inhuman in the way that the digital map is said to be inhuman now. But I think what we're trying to suggest is that mapping technologies are these mixed reality spaces. So the medieval map is mixed reality. Modern current technologies are mixed reality, and they're not either or. They're not dominated by a rational regime, and therefore there are places to explore in their paradoxical nature.
But building on that, I guess, is something that I've grappled with in trying to represent or photograph mirages. Is I think you're getting at this, the performative or the liveness of that event. Once it's something that I've kind of struggled with is once it's fixed on film, it kind of maybe becomes drained of its mirageness, its mystery, and its own weird physicality. So as an artist, that's one of the things I'm kind of contending with, and there are other ways in which I'm trying to materialize it outside of photographs, because I'm still not quite convinced whether a mirage is actually photogenic, which even though it's very photographic, it might not be photogenic.
I just wondered if you'd thought about different other cultural explanations for mirages. I mean, you talked about the sort of scientific one and general photographic one. I'm an archaeologist, so I often work in the desert in Western region, and I work along the coast of Abu Dhabi, and I often see mirages. Of course, when I see them, I don't see hamburger joints. I see lost cities in the desert and archaeological sites, and then when we eventually have driven 3 hours in the desert towards where we can see something, we're very disappointed when it turns out to be an oil drum or some rubbish from an old camel camp. But going back to your northern peoples and that story, I wonder if you could say something more about these cultural explanations, because I'm interested in the sort of, the people who live in desert areas, the people who live in the polar north, the areas you show, and how do they explain mirages? That's my question.
Well, one, the Inuit legend is actually really cool. There's this figure that looks like it's half human, half caribou, and it always appears kind of on a rippling surface, and it indicates a mirage. But it figures and appears when hunters go out alone tracking animals over long distances. In the same way that you're describing, they're seeking something, they feel like they're making no progress, so this creature appears. The creature also has the ability to wipe out memory, which I think is really interesting. When you see one of these things, you're likely to never not remember it, so you have to tell someone really quickly that you saw it. So we've explored some of the Inuit folk tales. We've begun to do that. But we were also hoping and wondering how they figure maybe in this part of the world in kind of early Arab texts. That's sort of, well, partly why we came and what we're hoping to learn from being here.